many people have the chance to truly be a part of history, but Peter Roussel is one of these people. Born in Houston, Texas, to Hubert and Dewey Roussel just 2 months before the outbreak of World War II, Roussel would go on to lead an impressive career in politics, public relations, academics, and the arts.
I had a great family. I was blessed with a super family. They were all in the arts in one form or another. My father was a lifelong writer and newspaper person. He was a columnist for the Houston Post from 1933 to 1966, and at the same time was the drama, music, theater, and film critic. So I grew up basically in a family where the father was a drama and theater critic. My mother was an actress. My sister was a ballerina and an actress. So I grew up in an arts-oriented family. So one would have thought that I would probably have done the same. And even though I didn't career-wise, it did instill in me from a very young age an appreciation for all those mediums. I was not an outstanding, what you call an outstanding student. I was okay. I was very sports-oriented when I was growing up. And when my father and mother and sister would want me going to the ballet or the opera or some show with them, I would begrudgingly go along, but I'd rather have been out at, a baseball game or football game or something like that. And pretty much up until after graduating from college, thought that was what I wanted to do for a career. I wanted to be a sports writer on a newspaper. I attended the University of Houston. And the reason I did was because at that point, I knew probably I was going to pursue a career in some form of the communications field. And at that point, the University of Houston, and still does, had a renowned program in radio and television. Most of my courses were radio and TV and journalism courses. The University of Houston at that time, and I assume today, it was very much like here at SAM. Students ran the programming at the TV station, most of it. You ran the cameras, you directed, you learned that craft. So it was great hands-on experience. You were on the radio station and did shows on there. We did remotes of the baseball games, and I was an announcer on the radio station. And just like here, we wrote for the newspaper. So you developed your skills in all those areas. Now, what we didn't have was a public relations firm like we have here at Sam Houston. There was no Priority One. And had I taken that, had there been such a course, who knows how that might have changed my career. I don't know. So I had a good, varied college career, and it was pretty much oriented to what kinds of things I would ultimately do. Although I didn't foresee at that point that I would have the career that I ultimately had. Well, first real job was working at a large, for Houston at that time, which was 1966, advertising agency. It's called Reeves Dyke, and it was a pretty good sized firm, and they finally signed me on. I say finally, I had one interview there where I basically asked the questions, and that was what got me the job. The guy said, he said, hey, you were asking good, aggressive questions there. That's the kind of person we want here. And that was really my first full-time job. And they signed me on as an intern, said they'd pay me and put me through a 2-year program where every 3 months I'd work in a different area to learn the business. And I did. They put me in production and then in copy and then in art and so forth like that. And it was great. I was starting to learn a lot about the advertising business. And I'd had no advertising classes in college. But what it also did for me, though, was I began to think in the back of my mind, this is terrific and I'm going to soak up as much of this as I can right now. This isn't what I'm going to ultimately do. And what happened, it just shows you how fate intervenes in your life sometimes. I'd been there about 2 months, and one day I saw all this political paraphernalia there for, it was in behalf of a then United States Senator from Texas, John Tower. And I asked one of the account executives there, I said, what is all this stuff? And he said, every 6 years, we handle Senator Tower's re-election campaign. We do all his collateral print material, his TV and radio spots. And he said, that's what all this is. We're doing that right now. So one of the account executives said, how would you like to go out on the road and be part of it? Write some stuff for Senator Tower. Well, I was so politically naive, which I was in those days. I said, gee, Bob, I'm not sure I'm for Senator Tower. He said, are you enjoying working here? I said, yes, it's terrific. Everyone's very pleasant. He said, great, then you're for Senator Tower. So the next thing I know, I'm in a TV station in Bryan. Here comes this United States Senator. Son, you got something for me there? Got something for you? I don't even know what I'm doing. Hopefully I had the good sense to keep my mouth closed and my ears open and attach myself to the elbow of the guy that did know what he was doing. And I quickly became fascinated by what we were doing there, which was actually producing a live television call-in show to go on the air that night live for 30 minutes, call in your questions to Senator Tower. And we were the producers of the show. And I was, as I say, I was utterly drawn into it. It was fascinating. It was theater. Well, a little while later, we were standing there, and a little while later, here came this buzzsaw of human activity. I would say about 30 reporters. I could see there were cameras, there were radio reporters, there was pencil press, and they all had this one person surrounded, and they was just moving along, and they're all yelling questions at this one guy. I went, wow. And he just moved right along. And so when they moved past, I pulled the elbow, the guy, the account executive from the ad agency, and I said, Bob, what on earth was that? He said, oh, that's Jerry Friedheim. He's Senator Tower's press secretary. Now there you go, folks. That was an epiphany in my life right there. It was like a curtain went up, and any doubt about my future was eliminated right there. I said, that is what I want to do, right there. Now, nobody had ever told me about the press secretary job. I'd never seen it in action. But as soon as I saw it, I wanted to do that. And I wanted to do it because it combined all the things I was interested in. It was theater, it was dramatic, it was media, it was political, it was everything I was interested in. So when things calmed down a little bit, I went over to this person. His name was Jerry Friedheim, and introduced myself. I said, Mr. Friedheim, my name's Peter Roussel. I work at Reeves-Dyke Ad Agency. Oh, Reeves-Dyke, y'all are doing great work for us. Keep it up. And I said, how does one get to be you, to be a press secretary? And he said, I'll never forget his answer. He said, there's 100 United States senators. There's 435 members of Congress. That's 535 people. He said, they all have a press secretary. You want to be a press secretary? Come to Washington, D.C. That's all I needed to hear. Now, it took me about a year and a half to get there after that, but at least it eliminated any doubt for me about where I was headed. And so, as things worked out, I got to know George Bush because he was running for Congress at the same time Senator Tower was. I didn't get to know him well. It was more, hey, how's your campaign going? How's your kind of passing along the way kind of thing. And about a year later, one day, this would be about April of 1969, Bush was a second-term congressman. Just at that point, just starting to emerge nationally. One day, I was up in Austin, the phone rang, and this voice on the other end says, hey, Pete, this is Congressman George Bush. He said, I'm in town to give a speech. I'd like to visit with you. Wow. And so I met him. We walked across the front lawn of the Capitol. He was going to have a press conference. And he said, I need a press secretary. He said, and you've been recommended to me. And I said, gosh, I appreciate that. He said, are you interested? I thought, good night. Of course, I was honored by his interest. And he had a top aide at that time, a guy named Jimmy Allison. He said, will you get with Jimmy tonight and work out the details? So we did. And as we were parting that night, walking off into the distance, I'll never forget this. Jimmy Allison yelled at me. He said, hey, Pete, one other thing. I said, what? He said, stick with George. He said, someday he's going to be president. Sadly, Jimmy Allison didn't live to see his prophecy fulfilled. But the night that Bush was elected vice president with Reagan, I went up to the hotel where he was. I leaned over and I said, it's too bad Jimmy Allison isn't here to see this. And Bush looked at me and he said, he's here. That led to a whole sequence of jobs, which I was blessed. Because every 2 years it was something new. I served out basically his congressional term with him, but then in 1970 he decided to run for the Senate in Texas. Ended up running against Lloyd Bentsen, and it was a hard-fought campaign. It was a long, hard campaign, but we ultimately ended up losing, and it was a tough one. Boy, there's nothing. I've been in a fair number of campaigns now, and it's much greater on Wednesday morning to be on the winning side than the losing side. You kind of feel like you've been on a train going about 180 miles an hour, and it just hit a brick wall. You kind of go, whoa, now what? It gives you a pretty empty feeling because you've just devoted a year of your life just to the intensity of all that too. But you pick yourself up and dust yourself off and start all over again. And at that point, it was kind of victory and defeat. He then got appointed by President Nixon to be the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations in New York, and a whole different kind of experience. And he called me up one day to see if I was interested in coming up there, and this shows you again how naive I was. And I was mildly interested in the UN, but I wanted to stay in politics at that point. I'd just been through 2 statewide campaigns. I was ready for more. But he gave me a piece of advice that I never forgot. He said, you know, my father once told me the way you kind of have a more interesting life is occasionally reach out for the unknown and try something you haven't done before. He said, 1 or 2 things will happen. Either A, you'll find you don't like it, and at least you've accomplished that, or B, it may turn out to be one of the more interesting experiences you've had. And then he said, and besides that, the airplanes are flying every day from Houston to New York, so if you get here and you don't like it, you can quit and go on home. Well, he knew I wasn't a quitter, so that's all I needed to hear. So I went there and was served with him the 2 years he was U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, which turned out to be 2 fascinating years at the UN. It's when the People's Republic of China was admitted to the UN. That was about a year's worth of debate that went on, and it was a fascinating debate. And it was political, and it was international politics. And boy, what an interesting time to be there. From there, Watergate was when Watergate was occurring in Washington. Of course, we were not involved in that in any way. But when it was all over and the dust settled, Nixon, or when it was going on, Nixon asked Bush to come back to Washington and be chairman of the Republican National Committee, which Bush, that was like, I'm going from this great position at the UN with all the fascinating issues we're dealing with back to politics in a sense at the Republican National Committee. But when you serve at the will of a president, you've got 2 answers you give. Either it was an honor to serve in your administration, Mr. President, I pass and I'm out of here, or you say, yes, I will serve. So we went back to Washington, and for 2 years he spent most of his time in that position trying to keep the glue on the Republican Party. It was a very difficult time for the Republican Party, and most of the time we were traveling on the speech circuit. And I got to see every state in the United States several times. So that was a totally different kind of experience. And then after Nixon resigned in August 1974, President Ford took office, or I should say Congressman Ford, or Vice President Ford took office as president. There was a lot of speculation he might name Bush vice president. Bush's name had cropped up in vice presidential speculation in the past, and it cropped up again on that one. But it didn't happen. Ford picked Nelson Rockefeller, had been governor of New York. And then what he wanted to do, when he'd been at the United Nations, he'd become very much a student of and involved with the whole China issue, People's Republic of China, because they'd been admitted in the UN when he was there. And the U.S. had just opened up a relationship with China, and he wanted to go there as in those days, it wasn't even a full ambassadorship. They called it Chief of the U.S. Liaison Office in Beijing. So he went to see Ford, and next thing Ford appointed him to that position. So that would have been like fall of 1974. And he said, hey, are you interested? You want to come with me? And at that point, I was almost 30, I guess, and I had just come off these 4 fascinating experiences with him: Congress, Senate race, United Nations and Republican National Committee. I'd had a diverse experience. I was so fortunate. Most people, they go to Washington, they do one thing. I'd already had all these different experiences. And I thought, gosh, China at that point was still pretty isolated. That'll be a minimum of 2 years. And I just told him, I said, I'll come visit you. How about that? And he said, that's fine. He understood. And I was, at that point, I figured I was headed back to Texas. And instead, once again, fate intervened in my life. But it also, and I try to convey this to students here, that the best way to get a job is to have a job. Because when you have a job, you're working with other people, and they see your performance, and they tell other people about you. When you're on the outside just looking for a job, beating on doors, nobody's seeing you. And therefore, the opportunities are much less. So I always say, get a starting job somewhere, even though you know it's not what you want to do forever. If you do a good job in that, it'll be a good thing for you, because other people will recommend you maybe to the area that you're interested in. And that's kind of what happened to me there. We had worked, while he was chairman of the Republican National Committee, very closely with the then political counselor at the White House, a guy named Dean Birch. And I was getting ready to go back to Texas, and Birch saw me one day and said, hey, what are you up to, Pete? I said, I'm getting ready to go back to Texas. He said, no, don't do that. He said, why don't you come over and work for me at the White House through the congressional elections of 1974. Well, Bush was getting ready to leave, so I went to him. I said, hey, what do you think? He said, hey, are you kidding? Do it. He said, I think that's a great opportunity for you to, hey, be working in the West Wing of the White House. So I did it, and worked through the congressional elections that year, and where the Republicans got really beaten badly throughout the country. And I thought, that's it, because Dean Birch, then he resigned and went back into private law practice. And I figured that was the end of my career there in the Ford White House. Well, apparently somebody had seen me a little bit or whatever, and the chief of staff at that time was Don Rumsfeld, later to become, Secretary of Defense under George W. and also under President Ford. And next thing I knew, I was working for him as an aide to him, the chief of staff in the White House. And I wouldn't have envisioned any of this. But I seized the opportunity and worked hard. And I tell students here all the time, life's real simple. If you work hard, good things will happen. If you work less hard, fewer good things will happen. It's real simple. There's no shortcut. So, and then we came on to the 1976 presidential election. I then transferred over to the President Ford campaign committee, because one of my mentors, Jim Baker, who had been in the Ford administration, he was running Ford's campaign, and I was assistant to him and helped him run the Ford campaign. We lost ultimately. It was very close, but we lost, and that was 1977. So at that point, all of us basically, Jim Baker, me, Bush from China. By then, Bush, I might add, had become director of the CIA. He was back in Washington. But when Carter went into office, that was it. We were all back in Houston. I had it in the back of my mind. I'd done all this, had all this experience now, worked for all these people, that maybe I should take a bid at running for Congress myself. And so when I got back to Houston, I started doing my due diligence and going around to see people that I thought might support me. And then one day out of the blue, I got a phone call from Jim Baker, who was back in Houston practicing the law again. And he said, come up to my office, I got something I want to talk to you about. And I said, great, I've got something I want to talk to you about, because I hadn't talked to him yet about this. So I get up there and he says, come in, close the door, sit down. And right away he says, I'm thinking about running for Attorney General of Texas. And I said, well, Jim, that's great, I'm with you all the way, 100%. He said, no, I want you to help run it. And I didn't even tell him that I was thinking about Congress. He said, so get a yellow pad and let's get to work here. And that was the one brief moment in my career where I gave running for public office a thought. It was the last time I ever did. And so I spent that year helping run that campaign, and it was a good race, but we lost in the end. And So then it was kind of what's next. And that's the way it is in the world of politics. You're either up or you're down. At that point, Bush started running for president for 1980 for the Republican nomination versus Ronald Reagan. So I was offered an opportunity to be the director of governmental relations for the Houston Chamber of Commerce. And I thought, boy, that'd be a great way to get re-immersed back into Houston if I do have political ambitions. So I accepted the job. And by the time the Bush campaign was going, I was in that job. And several people talked to me about coming into the campaign. And at that point, I was just I thought, golly, I've just come out of all that. And I know how campaigns are. It's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I thought, man, I'm kind of trying to get, again, reestablished in Houston. Maybe I should just stay here for the moment. And everybody understood that. So I did. And so then fast forward, and Reagan wins the election and Bush goes in as vice president. Well, I was still in Houston at that point. Jim Brady, who was a longtime friend of mine in Washington, great guy, had been press secretary to various people in Washington. They picked him to be the press secretary, which I thought was a great move. Jim was a very qualified guy and well liked by the press. And he called me up one day in the interim before Reagan was nominated and said, would you be interested in being my deputy? And I said, Jim, I really appreciate your offering me that. I said, I'm kind of back in Houston, kind of trying to get resettled back here. And I said, I think I'm going to stick with this for a while. And he said, well, if you change your mind, let me know. I said, fine. He then asked my good friend, another good friend of mine with whom I'd worked in the Ford White House, Larry Speaks, and he took the job. About 4 months later, I'm sitting there at the Chamber of Commerce in Houston. Phone rings, I pick it up, and somebody says, hey, did you see what just happened in Washington? I said, what? They said, some guy tried to assassinate Reagan and also shot your good friend Jim Brady. Of course, I was stunned like everybody else, and I turned on the television, and it was all unfolding there. And well, the result of all of it was Reagan was wounded, and Jim Brady seriously wounded. And right away, in those days when you still had telegrams, I sent a telegram to Larry Speaks. I said, because I knew I worked in the White House. I knew what it's like there, and I knew he was swamped. And I just said, Larry, if you need me, I'm here. Mm-hmm. And about a week later, I got a call from Jim Baker, who was chief of staff, and he said, hey, Larry's swamped right now. You've worked in the White House before. You and Larry are friends. We're all friends. You know how it works. Mm-hmm. You could come about here, right? You're friends with Brady, so you could make it. You could make a contribution right now. I said, Jim, you don't have to ask. I'm on the way. So unexpectedly, I go back to the White House again to serve a second tour of duty. This time as a spokesperson for the president. And I will conclude this by saying on the very first day I was there of work, I stepped right into history in the making, because Jim Baker dispatched me on the first day I was there, sent me to Phoenix, Arizona to handle the media for the nomination of the first female Supreme Court Justice to the United States Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. And that, I would say, that moment was certainly, and maybe the most notable moment of my entire career, because it was truly history in the making.
Peter Roussel would serve as the special assistant to the president and deputy press secretary under the legislation of President Ronald Reagan. He would then move on to serve as Jim Baker's special assistant and then his communications director. After moving on from politics, Roussel served as executive vice president of Newman Roussel Public Relations. He is currently the Philip G. Warner Endowed Chair at Sam Houston State University, where he teaches the course The Press and the Presidency, using his time in the White House to educate students at Sam about the relationship that the press has with the White House. He also instructs a course that functions as a PR firm, Priority One. Finally, Roussel is the author of a novel, Ruffled Flourishes, a satirical account of a White House press secretary, which was then adapted into a play and debuted at Sam Houston State University. Obviously, Mr. Peter Roussel has experienced a unique and fulfilling career, and he has this bit of advice for students.
A piece of advice I'd give to all Sam Houston students, and I base it on what happened to me in my career, as you're about to graduate, have an open mind. You may find when you get out there, out into the public arena, that you'll come across something you hadn't thought about for a career. And you'll want to pursue that. That's exactly what happened to me. If you told me while I was sitting in a college classroom that someday I'd be a spokesperson for the President of the United States, I would have said, "You are from Mars. I just want to be a sports writer on a newspaper in Texas." You know what? I never got to be a sports writer on a newspaper in Texas. But I had an entirely different career, and one that was fascinating.